Hello, I'm Stephen McInerney, the Academic Director and Deputy CEO at the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. Today we're looking at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the poem that launched the career of T.S. Eliot, probably the most influential poet and critic writing in English in the 20th century. And to discuss the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I'm joined by Laurel Moffat, independent scholar, researcher and writer who lives in Sydney, and Kishore Saval, who's been recently appointed as Senior Lecturer in the Western Civilisation program at Australian Catholic University. Kishore was formerly at Brown University and is a graduate of Harvard University. Laurel and Kishore, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start by looking at the title of this poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The thing that immediately strikes me is the tension in the line, which then comes throughout the poem, between a love song and the very prosaic sounding name of the protagonist, the speaker of this love song, the singer of this love song, if you will, J. Alfred Prufrock. Prufrock, as a number of people have pointed out, is itself a rather ambiguous name. It is suggestive of sort of feminine attributes, pru and frock, but then it also has this very hard rock in it, and also this very scientific word, proof. And the volume in which this poem first appeared was called Prufrock and Other Observations, which again conveys a very scientific sense of what this poem might be about. What do you make of the title?
Well, I like what you were saying about this tension, because I was also thinking about how the title itself holds within it this idea of a love song or a lyric, something that's quite expressive and emotive, with a name that sounds like you'd find it on a plaque outside a solicitor's door. You know, it's that kind of the everyday pedestrian, but kind of formal name with a love song. So these two things that ostensibly are going to be held in tension in this poem, but also with the name Prufrock. His name brings to mind just, if you just flip it in a way, touchstone, or, that perhaps he's someone that could represent more than just one character. So those are some of my thoughts.
That's interesting. He's multifaceted, isn't he? He does represent multiple voices.
Multiple voices, and also it kind of begs the question, is he something of an everyman, or is he a singular character? So those are some of the questions I have as I enter the poem.
Yeah. Kishore?
Yeah, I think this attempt to bring in something more prosaic into the world of the lyric has a lot of different implications for Eliot. I mean, on the one hand, he really is actually trying to bring into lyric poetry some of the features that he found in the greatest prose of his time. He, like Pound and some of the other modernists, felt that this was a time in which some of the best examples for how to write poetry was coming from people like Flaubert or Henry James, prose writers. But also, when you think of somebody like Flaubert, you're thinking of somebody who is more willing to talk about this, what is prosaic in that other sense, what is seems a little bit more diminished, more doesn't fit into our normal understanding of what lyric poetry is.
So the kind of common, everyday kind of thing?
Yes, exactly, the mundane, yes, I think that's
Which
right.
makes it very modern, doesn't it? Or certainly at the time.
Yeah, I mean, and also if you're thinking, I guess, of the novels at the time, like Conrad, who he then does reference. He's doing something similar, a rejection of this kind of high-vaulted prose to something that examines the way humans live in the world now.
Yes, I think that's right.
And sometimes the brutality of it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, and something that I hope we will get into soon, it's an attempt to bring in more aspects of social experience than we would otherwise expect to see in lyric poetry. we tend to think of lyric poetry as something that when a person says, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, you're not interested in the person's name or socially specified aspects of them, of who they are. But Eliot's poetry, his lyric poetry, often contains those elements that we tend to think of as novelistic. Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchants, CIF London, documents at sight, asked me to luncheon at the Canon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. This sounds like something you'd read in a novel.
This is the way
Or a diary.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Like an everyday entry.
Yes, that's right. And it seems that, for reasons that we may get into, that Eliot feels that lyric poetry has to put this more socially specified side of human experience into lyric. Yeah, so I think that...
But interesting, he doesn't get so specific where he's not naming someone. You know, as in the women or the woman in this poem doesn't have a name.
Yes.
But yet she's got arms that you can almost see.
Yes.
So it is really specific and also general at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that this is a poetry that's leading in peculiar ways in the direction that we come to see with something like The Wasteland. I think that, you know, one of the great phrases or terms that becomes important in the post-Enlightenment world is the phrase self-consciousness. Hegel says that a substance is also a subject because it becomes conscious of itself. Self-consciousness is thought of as something great, but in Prufrock we see self-consciousness in that other sense, that is, say, self-consciousness as a paralyzing inhibition. Wow. And I think that this excessive self-consciousness is actually something that eventually results in something that actually happens to Eliot, which is a nervous breakdown, a breakdown of self-consciousness, where then he has to pick up the pieces and find some other way to write lyric poetry, one that perhaps draws less upon this subjectivity, this self-consciousness, and draws more upon objects and socially specified aspects of experience.
There's something else that's very much at odds with what we expect in a love song, and that's there in the epigraph from Dante's Inferno, which Eliot, of course, doesn't translate, which says something in itself, I think, important about Eliot. But loosely, it paraphrases as this character in the Inferno saying to Dante and Virgil, you know, if I thought you were going to go back to the world and tell my story, I wouldn't say anything to you, but knowing that no one ever leaves this gulf, hell, I will speak to you. So here we are suddenly in hell. We're in the Inferno, which is not, again, what we associate typically with a love song. Kishore, could you explore a little bit the significance, perhaps, of the epigraph?
Yeah, this is Guido da Montefeltro, who, when they encounter him, is speaking in tongues of flame. And that's why when you hear that opening, "Se io credesse che mi risposta fosse a persona che mai tornasse al mondo," those S's are supposed to have this sort of hissing, flame-like sound, which is interesting because when you look in the poem, you have lines like, "We've lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown," where the S sound is a watery image. So whereas the epigraph is one of flame, the poem itself is one of drowning. But Guido da Montefeltro is in hell because he persuaded the Pope, Boniface VIII, to betray a member of the Colonna faction by promising this member amnesty if this person left their safety, and then immediately reneged on that amnesty. And Boniface promised Guido absolution if he would do this. And Guido then becomes a Franciscan friar, and just as he dies and he's on his way to heaven because Francis is going to take him for heaven, a black cherub comes and grabs him and says, no, 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 I've been waiting for this moment. He was meant for me. And then he says something like, perhaps you did not know that I was a logician. So why is this cherub, and by implication the devil, a logician? What is the error of logic? The error of logic is that you can't will and repent in one and the same instance. You can't both will and repent. So how does this relate to Prufrock? Well, it relates in a peculiar way. Yes, in a sense, Prufrock is somebody who is both willing and repenting at the same time. He wants to do something and then he doesn't want to do it. He's paralyzed by self-consciousness in that way that we talked about. But it's also oddly inappropriate for this poem. That's a poem. That epigraph is the story of someone who confronts serious damnation. These are very high stakes of good and evil. And we get the sense that, that those high stakes of good and evil, Prufrock never rises to those high stakes. So there's a certain sense in which the epigraph is about a person who is incapable of that kind of damnation.
That's a really interesting point, Kishore. I actually hadn't thought about that as far as him being incapable, caught as he is between will and repentance, that perhaps he's even incapable of damnation because he's kind of frozen in a way. I guess my question is that state of indecision and being frozen, is that in itself a type of torment? Is that in itself a type of damnation? It feels like it in the poem, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's like the sinners in Dante's Limbo. It seems that those figures in Limbo is something that preoccupied him. He seemed to talk a lot about people who are incapable even of damnation, and yet that is a kind of that is a sin. That is a torment that preoccupies him.
And that kind of being caught in a middle place that's the feeling I get from this poem, because like you mentioned, I thought it's such an interesting point about we've got flames, indirectly or obliquely referenced at the beginning, the water with the mermaids. Those are two elements. But for the most part, we are held away from the natural world in this poem, and instead we're kind of dealing with the detritus of human life in a city, or there's fog, there's stuff in gutters, there's pools of water left by people. It feels like even here we're in like a middle zone, not fully experiencing the natural world, not fully experiencing, say, the world of love. I don't know. That
natural world is only evoked in these fantasies, in these moments where he says, yes. I should have been a pair of ragged claws.
Scuttling on the ocean floor, like being a crab or something, and mentioning the mermaids. But it's not a direct experience of it.
Yes, yeah.
And the other thing I think on this point is that the souls in Dante's hell, in Inferno, are incapable of changing their state. They're fixed. That's where they are now forever. And there is this sense through this poem that, notwithstanding his desire, that Prufrock is unable to get out of his indecision. He's incapable of, he is very much like the patient etherized upon a table. He's someone who is sort of there, exposed, frighteningly exposed in different ways. He feels so vulnerable, so worried about what people think of him. These women that come and go, talking of Michelangelo, but he wants to reach out. He wants to engage, presumably with one of these women, who is perhaps the person he's addressing in the opening, but he never really does.
He gets the perfume, like the scent of her, but not a direct relationship with her. And they even, I was thinking as you were speaking, like, we're a bit removed from the natural world. We're also removed from the world of culture. He overhears them speaking of Michelangelo, but he's not actually engaging with a work of art himself.
No, but internally, of course, through the poem, he's constantly engaging with high European literary culture,
That's
isn't he?
really interesting, is that he's doing both at the same time.
Yeah,
the
and in
speaker
fact,
and the poet.
you know, that the very first line, "Let us go, then you and I," it's reminiscent. I'm not sure whether Eliot's deliberately, you know, throughout the poem he alludes to the Bible, to Shakespeare. Obviously, we've mentioned Dante, and other authors, Andrew Marvell, to his coy mistress. But here in the opening, I'm reminded of Marlowe's "The Passionate Shepherd to His Love." "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove." And, you know, even prove and Prufrock and so on. But there you have, you know, the shepherd passionate about this woman and just putting it on the line, "Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove." You know, we're going to be together erotically in every way, and this couldn't be more diametrically opposed to that.
Yeah.
"Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table," and it just goes on. "Let us go through certain half-desert," you know, never gets to the point.
Wandering, yeah.
Exactly, never gets to, as he says, you know, he never forces the moment to its crisis.
And that the poetic form mirrors that a little bit. "Let us go, then you and I." I think it may have been Helen Wendler who said that the first few beats are an anapest. So an example of an anapest, it's two shorts followed by a long. An example of an anapest is, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." Da-da-da, 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 da-da-da. And you see it in Byron, in in Byron, in Robert Browning, in poems that are about action, that are sort of, because it has that rollicking sense. But what we have here is an anapest then followed by iams. An example of an iamb is da-da, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" So you have, "Let us go, then you and I." And this is mirrored elsewhere in the poem.
So it slows it down.
No sooner is there this rollicking action than it peters out into iambs.
Yeah.
So that you have, in other cases, "Do I dare to eat a peach?" Or perhaps another striking example is, "In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute shall reverse."
And it's reflected also in what the fog does. You know, the fog seems to be, you know, at one point it's feline, you know, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, you know, and then it continues this extended metaphor as the cat, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So this idea of Prufrock wanting to make a sudden leap, but instead curls once about the house and falls asleep, as it were. You know, so the constant sense that we're moving to something and then we're slowing down, we're procrastinating and then never getting to the point.
But also that this fog is doing something quite domestic, like you're saying, like a house cat, but yet it's outside of the house. It's not actually a part of the internal world of even a home.
Yeah.
It's outside.
And it's something sensuous, you know, it licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. And it's sort of, it's ugly as well, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains. You know, there is this tension also through the poem between, as you've suggested already, Laurel, between the sordid cityscape and then these, you know, romantic desires, you know, and the natural world, you know, you mentioned the waves combed white and black. And the wind on the ocean and so on. You know, there's a frustrated romantic here, isn't there? Prufrock is a frustrated romantic. Eliot, notwithstanding that he seems to be rejecting romanticism in a very overt way, nonetheless himself seems to have these romantic yearnings. And it's perhaps the fact that they're unrealised that leads to this disappointment, this sense of, you know, life is disappointing ultimately.
And also, I was thinking about when I was reading this, and this is the matter that he's dealing with. You know, this is the world that T.S. Eliot is showing us. It's our world. It's the world we've made. And here's Prufrock in it. And I was reminded of that toward the end of Hamlet. You know, that Act 5, Scene 1, you know, there's no ancient gentleman but gardeners ditches and grave makers. They hold up Adam's profession. And when I was reading that, I was thinking, actually, is this a bit, and as in there's no honest person who doesn't deal with dirt. And this is what Eliot's doing. He's dealing with dirt. It's not the Renaissance poet's dirt of a shepherd or a gardener. It's not the romantic poet who's going to do something, a grand story. He's walking on small feet, iams, through streets that look just like our streets. And I think that there's an honesty in it as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is something that really gets to what makes Eliot great, I think, is that there's a line he has in one of his later essays. He's talking about the novelist Stendhal, and he says, Stendhal's novels are a humiliation to read because of the exposure of illusions of feeling. And the idea that part of what can make an artist great is that they expose us to feelings. They make us realize that some of our the feelings that we wished we had are illusions, and that instead they expose us to feelings that are humiliating to have. I think that Eliot became such a major figure that in his criticism and in other things, he's identified with this word magisterial, that he's the magisterial critic and so on. But his poetry is not magisterial in that sense. It's very exposed. It's humiliating. He's willing to expose.
Well, there's great vulnerability.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Not only here, but throughout. It's in The Wasteland, it's in Four Quartets. That was a way of saying it, not very satisfactory. There's this sense in which, both Eliot and in this case the protagonist, there's something consciously unheroic.
Yeah.
And yet he's engaging with, figures in this poem too, like Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. He says, Prufrock says, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be, with the allusion to be or not to be, am an attendant lord and so on. And
who tend to be quite foolish in some ways.
Yeah, well he says, doesn't he, almost at times the fool.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing that strikes me, and it is strange when you think about what a eminent figure Eliot is, and yet he's dealing with very, very prosaic figures here, very, in a sense, ordinary figures. This is someone, I mean, everyone knows this who's taught it, that young men in particular relate to this poem. Especially those that love reading and love culture. They're often older than they really are. They seem older than they really are. They're sort of awkward, self-conscious, unsure of themselves, and so he does speak even now. 100 years or more since this poem first appeared. He does speak to us as our contemporary, and all the anxieties of this sort of new world that was coming into being, and the Great War was going on when he wrote this poem, and all of that sort of modern bric-a-brac and paraphernalia that finds its way into his poem, that's still our world. And yes, I'm struck by these references to Hamlet. I'm not Prince Hamlet, but there's a sense in which he is like Hamlet. It's one of those double ironies that Eliot loves. He's not Hamlet because he's not a heroic prince, but he is Hamlet because he can't act. He can't decide. He can't make up his mind.
Although those are fighting words, aren't they?
They are fighting words about Hamlet, but
yeah, I think there's some debate about that.
Yeah, there is. But I think no one would doubt, a great word for Hamlet, no one would doubt that Hamlet is uncertain, that Hamlet is unsure of what he should do, or at least he's unsure of how to do what he should do. Let's put it that way. But in any case, I think he is a figure very much caught, like Hamlet, between what he wants to do and what he actually does do or doesn't do.
Well, and also to go back to your point about the will and repentance, I mean, that would align with Hamlet as well.
Yeah.
Like, which choice will you make as far as how will you act? And which line?
That's right, and in drawing on Hamlet, or in drawing on Marvell, and drawing on all of these, on Dante, there's something that reappears in Eliot's poetry in which people are engaged in some mundane activity, some everyday activity, they're having a meal, and then suddenly you're dropped into the Last Supper, some evocation of another version of that experience which is far more deeply meaningful. And the question is, why are these things always being brought together? Why are these different experiences, why are the speakers in these poems experiencing these different registers of the same experience? I mean, one way of looking at it is that our current experience is always just a diminished version of that one. But there seems to be some, and that does seem to be what's going on here very much, but there does seem to be another sense in which Eliot is trying to do something else. He's trying to organize his experience or to understand his experience in such a way that those other registers of that experience are somehow alive at that same moment. That it's not that, look how great the Last Supper was, look how diminished our meal is, but somehow that the Last Supper and this meal are happening at the same moment.
That's really almost like a sacredness of the everyday, like as in you can look at something every day and just, or just something average and seemingly mundane and kind of brush it away as meaningless, or you can actually realize that there's meaning even in that.
Yeah, there's something in the fact that the everyday still exists is still saturated by all this other, by the memory of all of these other experiences. That Eliot speaks in, I guess it's in Tradition in the Individual Talent, where he says, history is not only about the pastness of the past, but of its presence. And the idea that these other experiences, whether they be in Ovid or in Dante, or these evocations of Elizabethan history in the wasteland, they are not just past, but they are present somehow, and so they're present in some very mundane experience that we're having. And what does their presence do? Is it there just to rebuke us for the smallness of our own experience now? Is it some other way of organizing our experience now? What does the presence of the past do in these poems? I really don't know, but it may be doing something more than just showing us how diminished we are now.
Yeah, and I guess it works. He's doing something really interesting then. With the whole challenge, I think, of art often is like, what are you going to portray? Are you going to portray life as it is, life as you'd like it to be, or are you going to do something different, which is perhaps use the materials of what is and actually point to something deeper, point to something that transcends your own discrete time frame, which that's what I see him doing here, is that, yes, it's a snapshot perhaps of a time, but it also feels a bit eternal, doesn't it? The fact that I read this now, I'm like, this is today, in a way, that he can kind of transcend the moment in which he's written it.
Indeed, and it gestures therefore towards, though he didn't know it, of course, but towards four quartets, time past and time present and so on. About, it's the intersection of the timeless into time. This always happens when one discusses Eliot, that one only just begins and then the time for the discussion is over. But we'll leave it there. Thank you both.
Thank you.